Bel Air, California. February, 1970. The garage is lit by a single overhead bulb. It is 6 in the morning. The rest of the house is quiet. Linda is asleep. Brandon, their 2-year-old son, is asleep. The neighborhood is asleep. The only sound is the soft shift of weight on the rubber mat and the controlled rhythm of a man who has been training since he could walk and for whom this morning session is not exercise. It is something closer to prayer. Bruce Lee is 29 years old. He is at the peak of his physical life. Not the peak of what he will become. He does not know yet what he will become, but the peak of what years of systematic, obsessive, scientifically rigorous training can produce in a human body that was already exceptional to begin with. His forearms carry veins like cables. His abdominals have been described by people who have seen them in person as something that does not look like it belongs on a human being. His striking speed has been measured in informal tests with people who own the equipment to measure such things, at fractions of a second that the instruments were not originally designed to capture. He is performing good mornings, a barbell exercise, weight across the shoulders, bending forward at the hip, designed to strengthen the lower back and the posterior chain. He has done this exercise hundreds of times. He knows the movement. He knows the weight. He has been conservative with the load this morning, working within what he knows his body can handle. Something goes wrong. The exact mechanism is not fully documented. What the medical records show and what Bruce Lee described to people in the months afterward is that in a single moment during that early morning session, something in the lower back, the fourth sacral nerve, the diagnosis would eventually conclude, was damaged. The damage was not gradual. It was immediate. A single instant of the wrong angle or the wrong load or both, and the architecture of the strongest back in the room was compromised. He finished the session. He did not know yet what had happened. He went inside. He showered. He ate breakfast. He sat down at his desk to work on a writing project he had been developing, a book about his philosophy of combat that he had been assembling in fragments for the better part of a year. He could not get comfortable in the chair. He shifted. He adjusted. He stood up and sat down again. The discomfort was there. Not sharp, not dramatic, just present, like a sound in another room that you cannot quite locate. By the afternoon, he could barely sit down. By the following morning, he could not get out of bed without help. The doctors were not encouraging. Bruce Lee had not been to many doctors in his adult life. He had the particular relationship with medical professionals that very physically capable people sometimes develop, a mixture of respect for their knowledge and quiet skepticism about their understanding of what bodies like his could do. He had pushed through things that doctors would have told him to rest. He had trained through things that doctors would have told him to stop. He had built his philosophy of the body on the principle that the body's limits were rarely where they appeared to be, that most perceived ceilings were psychological constructions rather than physical facts. This was different. The diagnosis came in pieces the way serious diagnoses tend to, a first opinion that understated the problem, a second opinion that clarified it, a specialist who looked at the imaging and told Bruce Lee something that no one in his position wants to hear. The injury was significant. The fourth sacral nerve was involved. Recovery would take time, not weeks but months. And there was a possibility, presented carefully but presented nonetheless, that certain kinds of training might not be possible again. The explosive, high-load, high-velocity movement that defined Bruce Lee's physical practice might be something his lower back would no longer tolerate. He was told to rest. Complete rest. No training. No sparring. No heavy lifting. Flat on his back, in bed, for as long as it took. The body would heal at the speed the body healed, and nothing Bruce Lee could do would accelerate that process, but quite a few things he might be tempted to do could slow it down or make it permanent. Bruce Lee went home and lay down. He was there for 6 months. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. The first weeks were the hardest. Not because of the pain, though the pain was real and constant. A deep, radiating ache that moved from the lower back down through the left leg, the particular signature of nerve involvement that anyone who has experienced it will recognize immediately and never forget. The pain was manageable. Bruce Lee had a high threshold for physical discomfort, built over years of training that regularly pushed past what the body considered reasonable. What was hard was the stillness. Bruce Lee had not been still since he was a child. His entire adult life had been organized around movement, around the daily practice of pushing the body further, understanding it more deeply, finding new edges and exploring what lay beyond them. His training was not a hobby. It was not even a profession, exactly. It was the primary language through which he understood himself and the world. Take away the training and you take away the vocabulary. He lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. Linda brought him books. He read them. He read everything she brought and then asked for more. He read physiology textbooks. He read philosophy. He read the Chinese classical texts he had been meaning to return to for years, the Tao Te Ching, the writings of Chuang Tzu, the Zen literature that had been sitting on his shelf since Seattle. He read Western philosophy alongside Eastern philosophy, not as separate traditions but as parallel attempts to solve the same problems, and he began writing in the margins of the books in a handwriting that leaned slightly forward, like someone always moving toward the next thought even when the body was not permitted to move at all. He began keeping a more disciplined journal. He had always written notes, ideas, observations about training, fragments of philosophy scribbled on whatever paper was nearby. But the journal he kept during those 6 months in bed was different in kind from what had come before. He had time now, the one resource he had never had in abundance, and he used it with the same systematic intensity he brought to everything else. He wrote about the body, about what it could and could not do and why, and what the principles were that governed its limitations and its possibilities. He wrote about fighting, not the techniques, not the choreography, but the deeper structure underneath the techniques, the geometry and physics and psychology that determined why some things worked and some things did not. He wrote about fear, about identity, about what it meant to be a Chinese man in America, to exist in a country that could not quite decide what category to put you in and tended to resolve the uncertainty by putting you in a smaller box than you actually fit. He wrote about water, not for the first time. The metaphor had been with him for years, drawn from the Tao Te Ching and from his own experience of what effective movement felt like from the inside. But lying still, unable to move, forced to experience his own body as an object rather than an instrument, something about the metaphor deepened. Water is not passive. Water is the most persistent force in the natural world. Water does not fight what it meets. Water finds the shape of whatever contains it and then, slowly, inevitably, finds the crack. Every crack, without fail, without rest. He wrote, empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend. He wrote it in his journal. He was not writing it for anyone else. He was writing it because he needed to understand it, and writing was how he understood things. He did not know that these words would eventually be spoken on a television program watched by millions of people. He did not know they would become, in the decades after his death, perhaps the most quoted distillation of his philosophy, the line that would appear on walls and tattoos and the opening pages of books about leadership and resilience and the art of living. He was just a man in bed with a damaged nerve, trying to find the principle underneath the pain. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. The physical recovery was slow in the way that nerve injuries are slow. Not a linear improvement from bad to better to good, but an irregular, nonlinear process full of days that felt like progress followed by days that felt like regression, with no reliable way to know at any given moment whether the arc was bending in the right direction. Bruce Lee was not a patient man by nature. He was a man of extraordinary self-discipline, which is a different thing. Discipline is the ability to do what needs to be done. Patience is the ability to wait without doing. These are not the same skill, and he had spent his entire adult life developing one while having little occasion to develop the other. The bed was a course in patience. He took it the way he took every course, completely with full attention, extracting every lesson it had to offer. He began to understand something about his own training that the training itself had prevented him from seeing. When you are always moving, always pushing, always adding more weight, more speed, more complexity, you develop a certain blindness to the foundation. The movement obscures the principle. The technique obscures the truth underneath the technique. Lying still, he could see the foundation. He saw that much of what he had been doing, Not all of it, but much of it, was decoration. Elaboration. Refinement applied to the surface of things rather than the core. He saw that the core was simple. Terrifyingly simple, in the way that all true things are simple when you finally see them clearly. The body moves. The body stops. The body redirects. Everything else is commentary. He began redesigning his training in his mind. He could not move. He could not test anything. But he could think, and he thought with the same rigorous precision he brought to physical practice, building structures in his imagination and then stress-testing them against everything he knew. He wrote pages. He drew diagrams. He filled notebooks with a system that was not yet complete but was beginning, for the first time, to feel like it might be. He called it Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. Not a style. Not a system in the conventional sense. Principle. A way of approaching combat, and he was beginning to understand, a way of approaching everything that began with the refusal to be fixed. No preferred shape. No committed form. The willingness to be whatever the moment required and nothing more. Be water. The doctors cleared him for light movement after 4 months. Full training after 6. He got out of bed slowly, the way a man gets up from a long illness. Carefully, checking each part of the body as it re-engages with the world. Feeling for the places where the pain had lived and noting with cautious relief that they were quieter now. He went to the garage. He stood in the middle of the mat under the single overhead bulb. He moved. Not the way he had moved before. Something had changed in the stillness. The movement was the same movement. The same hands, the same feet, the same body he had been training for 20 years, but it was coming from a different place. Quieter. More deliberate. As if the 6 months of forced stillness had stripped away everything that was habit and left only what was true. He trained for an hour. He went inside and wrote in his journal. The entry from that day has been preserved. It does not describe relief or triumph or the satisfaction of returning to something missed. It asks a question the way so many of his journal entries ask questions. What did the stillness teach that the movement could not? And then, beneath it, the beginning of an answer. Everything. What came after the injury is well documented. The films. The philosophy. The name that became permanent in a way that names rarely do, not famous in the way that fame usually works, dependent on continued production and continued visibility, but embedded the way certain things become embedded in the culture and stay there regardless of what happens next. Enter the Dragon. The interviews where he sat across from hosts who did not quite know how to categorize him and explained, with patient precision, what he was trying to do. The demonstrations, Long Beach, the television appearances, the private sessions with champions who left those sessions and went home and trained differently. All of it came from the 6 months on his back. Not directly. Not in the simple sense that the injury produced the ideas. But in the sense that the forced stillness created the conditions under which the ideas could finally be seen. The training had been moving too fast. The philosophy had been forming underneath it but had not had space to surface. The bed gave it space. Linda Lee, decades later, described those 6 months as the period that made everything else possible. She said that the man who got out of bed was not exactly the same man who had gotten into it. Not different in the surface ways, not gentler or harder or more or less present. Different underneath. More settled in something. More certain of the ground beneath the ground. Bruce Lee himself said very little about those months in public. He did not make a story of his suffering. He did not present the injury as a hero's trial, a necessary darkness before the light. He simply returned to work and worked harder and built things that had not existed before. But the notebook remained, filled with the thinking of a man who could not move, working with the only instrument available to him, finding in the forced limitation of the body a freedom of the mind that the body in motion had never quite allowed. Be formless. Be shapeless. Be water. He wrote it for himself. The world found it anyway. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day.